It's chapter 22 and the mysteries have been revealed, but not the way we wanted them to be. Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. Ishiguro opens this chapter in the middle of the previous conversation, and while you might think this would come off as a little disorienting, the reality is that I don't think anyone really stops reading after chapter 21. For me at least, it's a dead sprint to the end at this point. Anyway, Miss Emily starts speaking, and right away some new information is revealed. We learn that Madame's actual name is Marie Claude, and that her and Miss Emily were partners in a project. Listen to Miss Emily describe their differing views on the outcome of said project on 256. Marie Claude worked hard for our project, and the way it all ended has left her feeling somewhat disillusioned. As for myself, whatever the disappointments, I don't feel so badly about it. I think what we achieved merits some respect. Obviously, what they're referring to has to be something to do with Halesham. And by giving Marie Claude and Miss Emily differing outlooks on the effectiveness of this project, Ishiguro has invited the reader to weigh in on the debate. It may, in fact, be one of the most interesting debates in the entire novel. But of course, before we can properly weigh in on the success of this project, we have to hear a little bit more about it. And Ishiguro doesn't make us wait long. Right away, we see just how much of Miss Emily's heart was in the Halesham project when she recalls, very grandmotherly, Kathy and Tommy's names. Cross-court, Madame, very pragmatically, points out that as sweet as this is, it doesn't really do much for any of them at this point. And so the ball bounces back to Miss Emily. Now, I'm not going to tell you what I think about the efficacy of Halesham at this point, but you should ask yourself that question. I'll tell you what I think after we finish the novel. And to backtrack a little bit here, maybe I was being a little too generous calling Miss Emily grandmotherly earlier. Sure, she remembers their names, has nice things to say about them, and even teases Kathy about the look she shared with her caretaker. But on one of Kathy's reconnaissance visits, she recognizes her and doesn't say anything. Plus, there's this. Unfortunately, my dears, I won't be able to entertain you for as long as I'd like just now, because in a short while some men are coming to take away my bedside cabinet. It's quite a wonderful object. George has put protective padding around it, but I've insisted I'll accompany it myself all the same. You never know with these men. So Kathy and Tommy are there to try and not die, and she gives them less time because she needs to supervise the delivery of her furniture? Now, I'm not saying Miss Emily's a bad person. She's under no obligation to them. But it's important to remember that even if she seems like the closest thing they might have to it, she's still not family. Miss Emily goes on to tell them the history of the deferral rumor, that it's been around for a long time, that couples used to break the rules in order to locate Halesham and investigate it for themselves. And finally, we get the heartbreaking reveal on 258. I came to believe that this rumor, it's not just a single rumor. What I mean is, I think it's one that gets created from scratch over and over. You go to the source, stamp it out, you'll not stop it starting again elsewhere. I came to this conclusion and ceased to worry about it. Marie Claude never did worry about it. Her view was, if they're so foolish, let them believe it. Oh yes, don't show me that sour face of yours. That's been your view from the beginning. After many years of it, I came not exactly to the same viewpoint. But I began to think, well, perhaps I shouldn't worry. It's not my doing after all. And for the few couples who get disappointed, the rest will never put it to the test anyway. It's something for them to dream about. A little fantasy. What harm is there? But for the two of you, I can see this doesn't apply. You are serious. You've thought carefully. You've hoped carefully. For students like you, I do feel regret. It gives me no pleasure at all to disappoint you. But there it is. Every time I read that section, I can't help but feel that Miss Emily isn't just talking to Kathy and Tommy, but to me. As readers, we want this rumor to be true for them. But in the end, Ishiguro tells us, with gentle apology, that it simply isn't. And there's one sentence that we read that I really want you to remember, because we'll come back to it. I came to believe that this rumor, it's not just a single rumor, What I mean is, I think it's one that gets created from scratch, over and over. If you'll forgive me once again bringing up something only to put it off, I just want you to mark this for now, because while I would argue that it actually represents a central theme of Ishiguro's overall work, it will be more effective to discuss it once we're done with this novel. So after hearing all this, Kathy is surprisingly calm. She's unsure if she can believe Miss Emily, if this might be part of the test. Still, Miss Emily denies. Still, Kathy and Tommy press. We find out some of the lore of this setting when Miss Emily explains. It was never true, even before the Morningdale scandal, even back when Halesham was considered a shining beacon, an example of how we might move to a more humane and better way of doing things. Even then it wasn't true. Miss Emily goes on to answer more questions, since she doesn't care much for the regulations designed to keep clones in the dark anymore. The conversation then turns to the gallery before Kathy asks one of the central questions of the novel, one some of you may have been asking yourselves for many chapters now. If we're just going to give donations anyway, then die, why all those lessons? Why all those books and discussions? Madame expands upon this point, reminding us that Halesham itself is an anomaly in this world. And I find Miss Emily's explanation to all this absolutely fascinating. Sure, she's a little self-aggrandizing, saying, I did all the worrying and questioning for the lot of you. But she's also striving for a noble goal. We took away your art because we thought it would reveal your souls. Or to put it more finely, we did it to prove you had souls at all. After reading 22 chapters of Kathy, Tommy, and Ruth's journey, I have no doubt that they do have souls. But as Miss Emily tells us, many people don't hold this conviction. And the reason why students at Halesham are seen as so special is because the other facilities are simply deplorable. The patient Kathy cared for in Chapter 1, the man who only wanted to hear about Halesham, suddenly makes sense to us now. But now, Halesham is no more, and as Miss Emily tells us, things are only going to get worse. And for all Halesham did, it can't and never could defer donations. Miss Emily tries to soften the blow by saying on 261, I hope you can appreciate how much we were able to secure for you. Look at you both now. You've had good lives. You're educated and cultured. But even though what she's saying is true, the past, no matter how good, is little consolation for having the future ripped away from you. Miss Emily then provides an incredibly fascinating history of Halesham and the donation process, and clones in general. As a nerd for fictitious history, I find this a nice break from what's otherwise a rather depressing chapter. We learned that cloning for the purpose of harvesting organs started after World War II, but by the 1970s, a movement headed by Miss Emily and Marie Claude won rights for humane treatment for some clones. The displays of these clones, or students as they called them, drew huge crowds and large enough support that other Halesham-like places were founded. Of course, the rights of Halesham students were not shared by all clones, and no one, not even the Halesham students, could avoid their ultimate fate. But it appears others did have that end goal in mind, even if Miss Emily was too pragmatic to openly dream of it. In any case, she was right. The mysterious Morningdale scandal brought Halesham and the other schools like it crashing down. There's a lot of other fascinating passages in Miss Emily's history lesson, how science was divorced from philosophy, how students were kept in the shadows so as to not bother the sensibilities of a world that now saw heinous conditions like cancer and heart disease as completely curable. But perhaps the most intriguing piece of history, and what Kathy asks about, is the Morningdale scandal, which turns out to be named after a genetic engineer who illegally used cloning to offer genetically enhanced children to the rich. Now, when I first read the novel, I thought this incident they kept referring to that brought down Halesham and the rights of clones everywhere would be a revolt or a smuggling students to safety or something exciting. But the truth is far less dramatic. Simply that the clones were too much of a hypothetical threat, that giving them equality, or anything close to it, would challenge and undermine the true human's place at the top of society. And unfortunately, this illogical view of the world is not confined to the realms of fiction. But Morningdale alone didn't stop Halesham. There was also a TV series that worked against it, and a reliance on donors who stopped contributing eventually. Miss Emily seems to have come to the conclusion that this end was inevitable, because beyond the scandals and public image lay a dark reality. The world didn't want to be reminded how the donation program really worked. They didn't want to think about you students, or about the conditions you were brought up in. In other words, my dears, they wanted you back in the shadows. Madame and Miss Lucy go on talking a little bit more before the movers arrive, and then that's the end of it. Tommy presses a little more, but Miss Lucy just gently explains that even if they were pawns, they were lucky pawns. That your life must now run the course that's been set for it. Tommy then brings up Miss Lucy, someone Miss Emily does not hold in the highest esteem. But Miss Emily is gracious enough to explain why on 267. She thought you students had to be made more aware of what lay ahead of you, who you were, what you were for. She believed you should be given as full a picture as possible, that to do anything less would be somehow to cheat you. We considered her view and concluded she was mistaken. And here Ishiguro again invites the reader to weigh in on the two sides of this debate, telling the students the full picture or letting them dwell in innocence. In other words, would they have spent their Halesham years better had they fully understood their future? Or was it this innocence of the future that made their Halesham years so magical? Again, we're served a question that easily and profoundly applies to our own lives just as much as it does to the characters in this book. And so Ishiguro presents us with a spectrum of different approaches to Halesham's mission. There's Miss Lucy, the idealist, who's full of passion and becomes discouraged by her inability to carry it out. On the other end is Madame, who can't fully get past her discomfort around the clones, but knows that morally they deserve better, and so she commits to work with the community until the funds dry up. And in the middle is Miss Emily, who takes small victories knowing they're better than the alternative. In the end, all three are unsuccessful in the long term. But just because the work they did was fleeting doesn't mean it was worthless. Miss Emily makes a good case for her approach, arguing on 268. We gave you your childhoods. You wouldn't be who you are today if we'd not protected you. You wouldn't have become absorbed in your lessons. You wouldn't have lost yourselves in your art and your writing. Why should you have done, knowing what lay in store for each of you? You would have told us that it was pointless, and how could we have argued with you? And to me, the chapters at the cottages prove her point. As opposed to the immense structure of Halesham, the cottages offer total freedom. Yet, the students continue to read, and Kathy even sees her final essay as a gift. In the hospital, Tommy finds comfort in his drawings, even if the motivation is misguided. And Kathy reads him classic works from antiquity. The three friends go out of their way to see a boat simply because it's specific, unique, and possibly even metaphorical. And so I'd say Miss Emily is correct. Her work at Halesham was worthwhile. I know this is all very shocking, an English teacher agreeing with a writer whose character says art is important, but it's a capital T truth you can carry out of this novel. Tommy's art doesn't defer his donations, but it is still worthwhile. As the conversation shifts and moves, Kathy critiques Madame, which brings another, darker truth from Miss Emily. Marie Claude has given everything for you. She has worked and worked and worked. Make no mistake about it, my child, Marie Claude is on your side and will always be on your side. Is she afraid of you? We're all afraid of you. I myself had to fight back my dread of you almost every day I was at Halesham. There were times I'd look down at you all from my study window and I'd feel such revulsion. She stopped, then something in her eyes flashed again. But I was determined not to let such feelings stop me doing what was right. I fought those feelings and I won. Now if you'd be so good as to help me out of here, George should be waiting with my crutches. So for all the optimism she projects, Miss Emily, like all of us, is susceptible to prejudice and hate. And while I'm sure she would never willfully use donated organs, there's no denying that the medical system, she's hopeful, will keep this contraption from being a permanent fixture, is built upon the murder of her former students and those like them. By the time Kathy and Tommy start to leave, the streetlights have come on, though the day has not yet completely turned to night. Miss Emily enters her car and is driven off, after the furniture, without Tommy and Kathy even giving much of a goodbye. But Madame is still there, and Kathy has one more mystery to uncover. What happened that day Madame saw her dancing to Never Let Me Go? The day Kathy saw Madame cry. Indeed, Madame too remembers that day, and Kathy asks her to go into more detail. Yes, it was that song. I've heard it once or twice since then, on the radio, on the television, and it's taken me back to that little girl dancing by herself. You say you're not a mind reader, I said, but maybe you were that day. Maybe that's why you started to cry when you saw me. Because whatever the song was really about, in my head, when I was dancing, I had my own version. You see, I imagined it was about this woman who'd been told she couldn't have babies. But then she had one, and she was so pleased, and she was holding it ever so tightly to her breast, really afraid something might separate them. And she's going, baby, baby, never let me go. That's not what the song's about at all, but that's what I had in my head that time. Maybe you read my mind, and that's why you found it so sad. I didn't think it was so sad at the time, but now, when I think back, it does feel a bit sad. I'd spoken to Madame, but I could sense Tommy shifting next to me, and I was aware of the texture of his clothes, of everything about him. Then Madame said, "That's most interesting." But I was no more a mind reader then than today. I was weeping for an altogether different reason. When I watched you dancing that day, I saw something else. I saw a new world coming rapidly, more scientific, efficient, yes, more cures for the old sicknesses, very good, but a harsh, cruel world. And I saw a little girl, her eyes tightly closed, holding to her breast the old kind world, one that she knew in her throat could not remain, and she was holding it and pleading never to let her go. That is what I saw. It wasn't really you, what you were doing, I know that, but I saw you, and it broke my heart, and I've never forgotten. Then she came forward until she was only a step or two from us. Your stories this evening, they touched me too. She looked now to Tommy, then back at me. Poor creatures. I wish I could help you, but now you're by yourselves. She reached out her hand, all the while staring into my face, and placed it on my cheek. I could feel a trembling go all through her body, but she kept her hand where it was, and I could see again tears appearing in her eyes. You poor creatures, she repeated, almost in a whisper. Then she turned and went back into her house. There is so much to discuss in just this one section of the text, whether it be Madame and Kathy forming a connection and how that connection helps heal some of Madame's prejudice toward the clones. But what I really want to focus on is that passage about Tommy. Now, the first few times I read it, it really confused me. Why does Ishiguro bring him up? The conclusion I've come to is that even though the conversation is between Madame and Kathy, Tommy too is a part of this. They must know that in a different life, that baby would be theirs. But in this world, that's the realm of fantasy. Whether it be the daydreams of a young girl or the prophecy of an old one, the result is the same. Tommy and Kathy really are on their own. This depressing reality manifests itself in one of the novel's most powerful scenes. On the drive back to the care center, Tommy, who had previously been very, very quiet, asks if they can pull over. Kathy is stuck to obscure back roads. Whether to avoid detection or avoid people in general, she doesn't say, but the result is that they're in the middle of nowhere. Tommy, once the car stops, runs into the darkness, alone, and just screams. At first, Kathy doesn't even think that the scream is his. It's so animal-like. And it's 3 or 4 screams before she can find him, standing, kicking, and swearing against fate in the middle of a windswept field covered in mud. A perfect parallel to that day Kathy first talked to him on the football pitch. For all his growth, Tommy is still that frightened, scared little kid, angry at the world that has abandoned him. And who can blame him? But this time, Kathy does more than just warn him about his polo shirt. I reached for his flailing arms and held on tight. He tried to shake me off, but I kept holding on, until he stopped shouting, and I felt the fight go out of him. Then I realized he too had his arms around me, and so we stood together like that, at the top of that field for what seemed like ages, not saying anything, just holding each other, while the wind kept blowing and blowing at us, tugging our clothes, and for a moment it seemed like we were holding on to each other because that was the only way to stop us being swept away into the night. Kathy and Tommy drive back, making light jokes about smelling of cow dung. Tommy clutches his drawings in his arms, and Kathy speculates that Tommy's rage as a child might have been because, at some level, he always knew. Both of them are growing up so much, but they're running out of time, and so are we. I'll see you in the last chapter. Thanks for watching.